If you're wishy-washy, you might develop an audience and then it'll come and go just like you are.
Welcome to the Truly Social podcast, recorded in Truly Social Inc.'s office studio in downtown Toronto, where TIFF shuts down the part of the city that lets everybody commute from east to west, and where we're still holding hope for Amazon's HQ2 location.
Every 2 weeks or so, we deep dive into the topic of all things social. Unless you think that we're talking social media, we are not. We come from the perspective that all things are social, or as I like to say, social is an approach, not a tool. We aim to tackle the subjects that connect people to people, people to brands, brands to brands, and bots to everything. We're on a mission to get social back on track. And who the heck are we? Well, I'm Tara Hunt.
And I'm Carlos Pacheco.
And this is Truly Social.
So, we're back. This is technically episode 7 of the Truly Social podcast at this point.
Ooh, 007.
007, yes.
Which is kind of perfect.
Yes. Why is it perfect, actually?
Well, because we have an international man of mystery here with us today.
That's a good reason. That's a good way. So we have our very own internal designer from Truly Social here with us, Alex Appugliesi. Appugliesi. Sorry.
So he always makes fun of me when I'm trying to pronounce
French words.
Well, French words and Portuguese words.
Yes.
Now
Okay.
he just got a taste of his medicine.
Exactly. So we're here to talk about a couple of pieces of content that were posted on our website. Alex wrote a blog post, What I've Learned as a Social Designer. And just about a week ago, Tara posted a video on her YouTube channel called What is a Social Brand? We're going to talk about, social and design, how social profiles and online, how you can bring design to the social era. Let's just start with Alex introducing himself and talking a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so my name's Alex Appugliesi. I'm a graphic designer here at Truly Social. I've been working here for...
Almost a year?
Yeah, almost a year now. Wow. Time flies. Mm-hmm. I've been a designer, like a professional designer, for almost 3 years at this point. I graduated from OCAD University in 2015. So my background is graphic design. So I learned very traditional instances of design, branding, logo design, all that kind of stuff, as well typography, all of the basics of design, graphic design. And from there, my first job was at a conference company designing brochures. So that was a very practical application of my design skills of just print, fitting everything into 3-page spreads, following a template.
Design, is it?
No, I think we were using something else.
Huh.
Yeah, it was weird. But that was a great kind of first stop out of school, just because I was able to use all of the skills that I had just learned. But my next job after that was working with and that was in the social space. So I worked on their social media team, and that was all different, new to me, just basically doing everything for their social platforms, Twitter, Facebook. We were on Snapchat, Instagram, and we had our own website, our own blogs. So that was just kind of new to me in terms of taking everything that I'd known about print and applying that to the screen. So those are two different mediums, and they are similar but quite different in terms of, font sizes and accessibility and colors being different from page to screen and all of those kinds of instances of, traditional media versus kind of this new media, and applying that to all the different social landscapes that there are. When I was in school, Instagram was still quite new. Twitter was the big thing, and brands hadn't really adapted to kind of advertising in that space and using it to its full potential, whereas nowadays it's kind of the first thing that you do. Okay. So from then till now, it's been quite the journey, but it's been quite fun. Yeah, well, one of the things that when you applied to the position at Truly Social that I was really impressed with was how you had up in your portfolio like all of these adaptations of
a brand across multimedia. I really love that, you showed how it works on like a mobile device. So when you're talking about cross-platform versus like web, you had like an example of like creating GIFs. And I don't think you had Instagram stories yet. I don't know if that was on there, but it was like you did have some sort of vertical video, I think, in there as well. Maybe it was Snapchat.
I did work on, we had an app at We, so we did work in that vertical landscape of designing icons and videos that would play if you click certain things. But we did actually have, that was kind of the start of Instagram stories, from photo and video, from being like where you had to post it on the day of shooting the picture or the video to then being able to actually upload from a later date.
Right.
So kind of that's all been an evolution in the past year and a half, I think. But yeah, so definitely going from kind of that square format of Instagram to now the vertical video, the vertical image, adapting those things to animation and all of the certain things that go along with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole squareness of images also before like was a departure from the horizontalness of images from before. So I mean what we've learned, I think, and what I talked about in my post and refer back to your post, Alex, was like, that you can no longer just create a brand guidelines document that gives like a 2D kind of like representation of the brand, because you're shooting, first of all, you were shooting horizontal video for YouTube, and social is different. Like social video is very different from like regular video in the first place. I actually have a video on that. We should link that in the description on how social video is different. So that just the essence of it. But then it turned square. People were able to start to do square videos in different places as well, including Instagram. But then it shifted to the vertical video. And I had some friends who were like holding on to horizontal video with like white knuckles, because you'd go to their Instagram stories early days and you'd have to turn your phone sideways to look at their stories, which of course would make your screen flip around and would drive me nuts. But they were like so tied to wanting to do horizontal, like they were going to force the platform into doing horizontal. I found like that's like more of a preference thing, but brands kind of do a similar thing
with design,
with their approach and outlook. And so when I wrote the post and I did my video last week on what is a social brand and how is it different, like I really wanted to cover those things that brands are like holding on to, just like my friends were holding on to with those knuckles, like mostly that's where I've struggled on the social side with people who are quote unquote brand managers who are like, that's off brand, to use a GIF or whatever, but it's like, yeah, but you have nothing in your guidelines on that side. So, speaking of that, you talked in your post about the multimedia side, but on the philosophical side of creating content for like Instagram or whatever, a lot of brands will come in and be like, well, we just want to run something that fits our brand guidelines. But you have different sort of advice on adapting that to the social platform. What are like sort of those things that you find that you normally have to change when it comes to helping a brand get more personable and social online?
I feel like with working with brands and trying to adapt their materials to different social platforms, it's more about using each platform to its full potential and not using kind of that cookie cutter formula of applying the same asset to every single platform at once. Because seeing that, I mean, the chances of seeing all of those posts at once on every single platform are pretty low. Yeah. But just having people come to your Twitter feed or come to your Instagram grid and see the same assets over and over and over again, it's really off-putting because it kind of feels like they're taking the easy way out of just slapping something onto social and calling it a day. Yeah. Whereas if you start to nurture those communities within those platforms of applying, you know, different treatments and using different imagery and using different styles and developing what it looks like on Instagram versus what it looks like on Instagram stories versus what it looks like on Twitter and Facebook. All of these platforms are different. They have different communities. They have different reach. So to make it worthwhile, you really need to take your time and see what works and what doesn't. Right. See, you know, does this perform well? If it doesn't, how do we make it better? Maybe this isn't the platform for us. Like, not every brand is going to work on every platform. I mean, it just depends on the tone of voice that you have, if you're willing to make a statement, if you're willing to push the envelope, if you're willing to stretch outside of your brand. But I feel like a lot of brands in general, they want to stay close to what they've already developed with either their design houses or in-house or with their, you know, the people they reach out to externally. They want to keep that under wraps and they want to keep it close so that it's easy to just whip up something and throw it out. Whereas going the long route and figuring out and developing what each platform means to them, it's a lot more work. It involves more time, more people, testing. It's just sometimes brands, they don't have either the stamina to do that, they just don't have the patience to do that, they just want to slap something out and move on to the next thing. Right. Especially with campaigns, and it just goes on and on and on with brands in general, just trying to keep everything close to their heart. Whereas in this day and age, I feel like it's more worthwhile to have a little bit more fun with things. I feel like social allows for that, whereas in a few years ago, like, it was all about traditional ads and bus shelters and billboards and print media. And
formats, right?
Right.
And you just have to stick to those formats.
Those rigid formats. And now you could have a lot more freedom with that, but I feel like it's not being taken advantage of as much as it should be. But I feel like people are starting to get their heads around it. It's starting to develop. It's just not developing fast enough, and I feel like by the time these brands start to develop, who knows if these social platforms will exist.
That'll be the next
right platform. So like it's like Twitter's kind of diminishing. Like by the time you get on Twitter, it could be dead. Like you have to really adapt at a quicker pace than traditional.
Various different trends happen on the platforms themselves. So even if, you know, well, I mean, I think Twitter has, it'll be around for a long time. It'll come and go in waves. Right now, they've had a bit of trouble, I think, a lot.
Actually, at this point, I think they're like sort of on a flat line more than like
going
down.
Well,
right?
I'm just, I think with what Alex is saying is like the audience is like spending less time
evolving
on there, and I think a lot of it has to do with trolls and stuff like that. But that's a whole other thing altogether. But when it comes to like Twitter, for instance, like there's so many trends that emerge, like the threaded like stories.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They started to emerge like sometime last year. They just like, you'd see them, and then now it's like a thread is a thing, right? Yeah. But like then a thread will be so over like in a few months, or maybe it's even already it's over, you know? Same with Instagram. Like there's different ways where people are like experimenting and pushing the envelope on how to do an album or how to even do a story, and how to represent themselves on that platform. But the only way you know how to push the envelope or you pick up on the trends early enough is if you're involved every day. So, I mean, if you're a brand, like investing that time to spend to watch these trends emerge is like really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the design, the people who work in the space of like graphic design and stuff like that need to sort of like understand like that these platforms are constantly giving you feedback, right? In the same way that, you know, creators online creators use, evolve their formats, right? And use sometimes their fans actually give them their guidelines in terms of like where they need to go. Brands can also use the social signals to sort of say, hey, by the way, maybe this logo isn't right, or maybe the aesthetic we should change, right? And there's a lot more flexibility in terms of like using the data to see, is this working versus the logo has to be on the top right side. No, it doesn't have to be. Like we're seeing, again, or
How do
different call to
graphic
actions.
designers feel about data, Alex?
Yeah.
Not you personally,
Yeah.
but
Okay, feedback. Oh,
I feel like
no, but I think it's like actually a fun question.
data, I feel like, is really important in a design sense because it actually speaks to your work, and if it works, if it doesn't work, you'd want to know that so you don't repeat those mistakes going forward. The feedback is important in a designer's scheme of things, because if you think that something's working and it doesn't perform, it's not getting the likes, it's not getting retweeted, it's not getting, it's not getting that sort of feedback from your audience, then you're not really doing the job that you set out to do. And to figure that out early on is much more beneficial than to keep doing things and to develop something into a bigger thing. And then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And then your community drops off and no one's paying attention. So I feel like as a designer who wants to make something for an audience, you want your audience's approval. And there's no better way to get that than to kind of look into the data and see who's viewing this. Are they staying here? Do they care? Are they liking? Are they dropping off? Like what is wrong? What is right? And how can we adapt that to the next iteration or, the next campaign, or however you're kind of approaching that kind of aesthetic and your brand guidelines and your social guidelines. Right. Like, how do you build that forward without it being kind of, you're just kept in the dark and you're just making things to satisfy either your managers or... Right. Yeah. So the data speaks volumes.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question, though, and you might have had this conversation before, is then how do you, I'm all about adapting and stuff to your audience, but then there's the whole... trap of design by committee, right? And I know that's could turn into equally bad. So how do you find that balance between getting rid of the sort of the trappings of the traditional rigid guidelines that don't allow you to listen to feedback, and then listening to too much feedback so you get mush?
Yeah. I mean, that's something I feel like will always happen, especially if you're working with a brand that has developed its look and feel over the years. And they kind of have a sense of, okay, this has been working for us and this is how we do things. And this is, this is how we generally have this post and this is how we use this color. Sometimes it can be damaging coming into it, especially if you're working externally with a brand and you're coming into this new and you don't know all of the backstory and you don't really know, what has been working for them because you're just stepping into these things. But I feel like you just really need to listen and you need to communicate with whoever you're dealing with in terms of, okay, so I tried it your way. Here it is. But also having those different versions of, let's tweak this. So if we tweak this, maybe this is a little bit more accessible to a different audience. Or, maybe these colors aren't working. You really kind of need to pick it apart piece by piece and not kind of change everything first go or kind of argue over where you're going to go, because then that kind of creates more of a toxic environment in terms of they don't really trust you, you don't really trust them, right. That trust is gone, then they don't really want to they don't want to cooperate with you, they don't want to collaborate with you, and then that just makes your job as a designer even harder to go forward with. So it's always best to kind of listen, take into consideration what they're saying, follow kind of their guidelines, but also try and introduce something maybe a little different, maybe a little bit more current, something a little trendier, something that you've seen that it may work for other brands, and say, okay, maybe we'll take this into consideration and maybe apply it and see if it works for us, or just opening up that possibility that maybe we can incur some change into the current thing, but not forcing it down their throat or just throwing everything like caution to the wind and just making that mush happen. Like, you want to really focus on the communication.
So like a bit of a filter. And I think a lot of that probably comes from experience too. What I think is interesting, so years ago when Pinterest first came out, like they broke the design standard, right, in a lot of what they did. But like by doing that, by being so ahead of the curve, they actually reset the design standard in a lot of ways. And I remember like everybody else like jumped on the bandwagon, but the designers, I find, like the people behind Pinterest, or even the people that work at Apple, any of the companies that are like lead sort of the pack in that we're going to do something new and then everybody follows, round corners, whatever it is, are generally the ones that they're not listening to what everybody else is doing. How do you do that? Like because I know that even you guys have done a lot of things here for our clients that I'm always like, that's such a cool idea. And it seems like, there's the ahead of the curve. Like, how do you stay ahead of the curve like that?
As a designer, you really need to keep your eyes and ears open, because like everything, it's cyclical. So it may not be in trend right now, but it always may come back. So right now the trend is kind of retro, right? So like chunky fonts and bold serifs and, those like crazier color palettes. And like 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, that wasn't a thing. But you just have to keep your eyes and ears open to figure out what works for the client or what works for the brand now. It doesn't really need to speak to everybody,
right?
But as long as it does its job and it doesn't blend in and it's not monotonous, and you're reaching out, I feel like that in itself is the progress. And then if it latches on later on, if it becomes a trend, if it becomes something bigger, great. If not, fine. But if it's doing its job in the moment, that's great. And then you can always adapt and go from there. But yeah, I feel like as a designer, you're not always trying to set out for the next great thing.
Right.
You're just trying to approach your current project and make it work for, the guidelines that you have, and make it work for the client, and make it work for your audience, and just make sure that it is, accessible, make sure that you're not restricting anybody, you're not kind of pushing anybody out, but that it just works for that certain, schematic of things. Yeah.
So when I define like what is a social brand, I think it's like the brand that right? Whether it's a physical thing or a service or something else that but like the more human, like likable, interactive, sometimes like
adaptable.
But like it's like that kind of the a little messier side of things. So like I think about brands on Twitter, for instance, like the Burger King and them, like they have this like it's just a burger or whatever, it's a burger joint, but on the social platforms they really come alive in a way where you can actually
human voice speak, right?
Like they can be a little snarky and all that, whereas like a lot of brands have a tough time adapting to these platforms because they are afraid of coming across as, I don't know, something negative to
they don't want to rock the boat too much.
And earlier you mentioned like you don't have to be liked by everyone. But how do you build that personality into a brand without, I guess, or does it matter if you offend people? Like, talk a little bit about that.
I mean, you definitely have to take into consideration what people like and what people don't like. And if you harp too much into what people don't like, then you're just going to create a brand that nobody likes. And in the scheme of things, you really want to reach some sort of a core audience, or you want to reach the masses, and then try and build your community through that. So either through, a likable voice of sanity, of, trying to be like harmonious and everything is just great and wonderful. And maybe you'll find an audience, a positive audience that builds everybody up and everything's just kind of sunshine and roses. But then you also have those brands that are kind of harping more on the negative and have more of a tone of voice of, I want to make a commentary on certain things, on political issues, on the climate that we're in right now. And I want to get people involved. I want to get people, rowdy, and I want to kind of incur this community of do-gooders, but also badass people. Like,
well, Nike's Kaepernick ad comes to
Yes.
mind.
Yeah,
when you're
right?
talking about that.
So like you see that campaign and you either love it or you hate it.
Yeah.
You either support it or you don't support it, right? So if that's your tone of voice, then you have to be strong with it and you have to really go with it, where you can't be wishy-washy in that instance. And some brands, they really want to capture everybody's attention, so they don't really want to have too much of a voice and they don't want to use too much of a tone. They just kind of want to, let's post an article and post the article. They don't want to say anything about it. They don't want to have that commentary. Whereas if you have a stance with something, then you know how to build your audience, because if the people that agree with you, they'll probably want to stay and they'll want to see what more of a commentary that you're going to provide. Or if they don't agree, then they know this isn't for me, right? So that's kind of an easier way to kind of pluck who's going to stay and who's going to go. So I think it's quite important to have some sort of a voice in your platforms, so that it's not always just cool brand shots, pictures of the product, pictures of people smiling. That gets boring after a while. It's monotonous. It doesn't say anything. It's just ad.
Yeah.
So I feel
there's nothing to connect with, right? So like we connect with in those controversial moments, in those extremes of personality, whether it's like standing for something like Nike, or maybe people could make the argument that they're standing for getting rich, but that's a whole other thing. They still did take a risk, or whether it's like being a certain personality in order to appeal to your audience. So if Burger King and all those fast food places, they're trying to appeal to a young kind of hip teenage audience, get them addicted to their chains, so they're going to talk like kind of troll like the teenage audience does. That's going to connect with people. Whereas, as you said, like a headline with an article, or just like a lot of neutral comments with promotions laced in between, just feels like, I don't know, if you think of the metaphor of a party, there's the people that you're really, like, even if you don't agree with them, you're engaged in conversations with them. Then there's like people that you're like, have tons in common with, that you're going to get into deep and then there's like the person that's like a cardboard cutout of a person who's like, nice weather. We've been having
The bots.
Yeah, like, and then you're like, okay, how fast can I get away from this person? It's kind of the same on social with brands, right? It's like, I'm going to be drawn to the person who has something to say, even if it's not something that I agree with.
And especially in this climate of people are thinking about their brands as, how do they improve our community? How do they improve our world? If they're just regurgitating the same thing over and over and over again. So like, for example, Victoria's Secret, iconic brands for years and years and years, but they're starting to face the decline of sales because it's the same message over and over and over again of that ideal sexy woman, toned and thin, and it's just that cookie cutter model in the Victoria's Secret fashion show. It's the same thing every year. Yeah. So when you have brands like Aerie who are introducing, you know, plus size models and models who are not airbrushed and look like, you know,
human beings,
it's, you invite that into your life because it reflects kind of maybe your values or reflects yourself, whereas Victoria's Secret doesn't really reflect you. So are you going to support a brand that reflects you, or are you going to support a brand just because it kind of falls on its laurels of being this iconic brand that everybody recognizes? It's really up to your community to decide. And right now, the community that relates to Aerie and relates to kind of this norm of that regular human being, they're going to flock there and not support.
Well, I think this also like brings up like this adaptability isn't only in the moment, like adaptability over time is really important, right? So Victoria's Secret worked really well in like an age where everybody sort of raced to a ideal, and now it looks tone deaf because we're able to recognize the multitude of body sizes, and
there's also a lot more voices out there sort of showing themselves off as real people, as opposed to before where we were inundated by media that was completely cookie cutter and, you know, like decided by people, right? Whereas now you're seeing a lot more user generated content, and then people becoming, you know, getting strong voices just without the need of being completely packaged up, right? So we're sort of much more used to that, right? We want that authenticity
well, and I think
in brands as well as the people that are online, right?
People have never been like the audience or the customer base. I mean, minus a few mass brands or whatever. Even then, I would say that they have the strong, loyal following. People have never been like cookie cutter, all the same. But for years, whether it's pop culture, television, movies, Victoria's Secret like brands, like making clothes, it's all been for a certain person, and usually it's like white person, you know, educated, middle class, like urban-ish, male, straight, you know, like the whole, that's like that center person that we're designing everything for. And because of social, what we've been able to, like those voices, as you said, like have been able to rise. And now it's not like we're in an identity politics, but what we're finding out is like, oh, there's more than one story out there. There's more than one taste. There's more than one outcome. And now when you put out something like a Victoria's Secret, like that has the same, like, you know, leggy, curvy white women, blonde white women on it, it like people look at it and they're like, yeah, we've had enough of that.
Yeah.
It's like Netflix has ruined me for regular television because there's so much diversity on there. And now I'm like, oh, another show about a white family in the suburbs? Oh, that's interesting. Not, you know, like, and whereas like, yeah. So.
And not to mention the bombardment of ads.
Yeah. So one last question, and I'll sort of set this up, is like, when I think of brand, and it's not just about a logo or your like colors and that sort of thing, but I feel like it's, you know, what makes you distinctive from other brands or other industries or whatever else there is out there. Like, right. How are you able to be still distinctive but adaptable at the same time? I guess is the
Yeah. I mean, you always kind of have to have that certain guideline that you follow, you know, with your different marketing assets and with your color palettes and all of that kind of stuff. I feel like there still needs to be that sort of guideline and that base model to start with, and then you just build upon it through developing your audience, through developing your social strategy, through developing your whatever you're doing in terms of campaign or building that audience. But there just needs to be that growth period of learning and figuring out, what do we want to say, what do we want to do, what are we trying to accomplish in this social age where everybody has an opinion, everybody is paying attention, and you can't just kind of slide everything under the radar and everybody absorb it. Everybody's kind of looking at things with a questioning eye, and you really need to stick to your core values and stick to your strengths and stick to kind of that baseline model, but you always really need to build upon it to then reach your audience and captivate that audience and maintain that audience. If you're wishy-washy, you might develop an audience and then it'll come and go just like you are.
Yeah.
If you're strong, if you're too strong, you might alienate an audience. But if you kind of test it out, figure out what works, figure out what doesn't, I feel like there's always room for growth. There's always room for change. And in this day and age, I feel like there's not that strict kind of guideline. There's no format to really adhere to. There's a multitude of formats. So if it doesn't work on one format, it may work on another. It's not about bombarding people on every single platform and every single medium. It's figuring out what works for you, what doesn't, and sticking with it and growing with it, so that way you can develop your future. And then maybe if it didn't work for you at the beginning, you've then established yourself on one platform, and then you can start building your way onto another one. So there's always that room for growth. It's not just kind of like a one and done.
Right.
Especially in this day and age, it's always, everything's changing. You never know, something might become something else tomorrow. Something new might come along. You know, everything's just constantly in flux. So just being able to adapt to that.
So have a strong core of who you are, how you represent yourself, but don't be afraid to grow and adapt with the times.
Yeah.
I think that's great advice.
That's great.
Awesome.
I also wanted to make a small note because, I don't have much to say when it comes to design, but I did go to college for typography.
Oh.
But I flunked out. Just FYI.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't know that part, but
It was one of those things where it's like, why am I studying about print when I know that it's not going to be a future?
But typography online is still very big, right?
Obviously. So.
Believe it or not, I'm walking on air. I never thought I could feel so free.
So now comes part of our podcast where we talk about our truly social heroes. These are people that inspire us. They're not necessarily the most popular people. They're just people that are doing things creatively and in a very social way online. And,
truly social.
They're truly social. Exactly. As usual, our guest of honor usually goes first. Alex, anybody that you'd like to recommend?
So for me, as a person who loves memes and loves reality television and is very much a consumer of that type of content, a person that I've been following for years and I think is quite the truly social hero of mine would be T.Kyle. So he is a person that I've been following through the Tumblr days. That was like
Tumblr.
maybe 5 years ago, maybe more. But just the growth of seeing him through, he used to just post these GIFs of reality TV shows. So Real Housewives and anything on Bravo. And he would post them on Tumblr and they would just grow in likes and likes and likes. And then he branched that off into his own channel of reality TV GIFs. And then from there, he was able to launch that into a digital social lead job at Bravo. So from just kind of a pastime hobby of really loving pop culture and really just partaking in that reality TV show genre, he was able to parlay that into a career. And he's still active today, and just his community is awesome. He knows his audience. He really caters to that audience, and he's just creating new things every day. And it's not just GIFs, it's also like meme clips of taking clips and applying music to it, and just for me it's hilarious. I get everything. I understand it. I understand the audience. I understand the appeal. And I just really think that he's doing a bang-up job of capturing the audience and continuing to grow.
So T.Kyle?
Yes.
At T.Kyle Mac.
Yeah,
On
T.Kyle.
Twitter and Instagram and reality TV GIFs on Tumblr.
Awesome.
That's
Well, we
awesome.
will link that
Definitely.
below.
Yeah, exactly.
My truly social hero is a brand personality who's not real, but feels really real online to me. And I think it's because they do a really great job of being that social extension of a character. Is BoJack Horseman. So love the show and the writing on the show in the first place, but what I love about like the Twitter, it's not like come watch my show or like just funny clips from the show or whatever, that you really feel like BoJack, who's like a fictional horse man, has woken up in the morning, taken out his cell phone and starts like
Tweeting.
checking Twitter and tweeting, and he like live tweets the show. Like it's like maybe they plan this stuff ahead of time. I don't know, but it feels like whoever is in that character has taken on that character so well that it's a social extension of a scripted show, and I love it. I think they do a really nice job. Actually, Netflix in general is very good at social in all of their programs, but BoJack is outstanding in my opinion.
Yeah, they definitely seem to embrace the voice of the show. Even, Netflix's accounts are usually very tongue-in-cheek and funny as well, sarcastic as well.
Yeah, and it's just like this, he can spontaneously get involved in conversations that I think is, and from a perspective that you're like, yeah, that's what BoJack in my brain would be
say.
as a human on Twitter. So, and if any brand can do that, like that's the goal.
Cool. So my recommendation would be it's a podcast, but it's also like an online personality. And we've last night I was listening to the latest Hello Internet podcast, which is hosted by Brady. I don't want to sort of Brady and Gray, which Brady is
Gray.
part of. He does a bunch of YouTube channels called Number File and a bunch of other ones, and Brady and Gray is CGP Gray, much more known for that. But the reason why I wanted to sort of focus on a podcast, because they do have YouTube channels and on social media, is that they're always sort of like have these really sort of rambly conversations in their podcast. And last night's, the latest podcast was called the Twitter War Room, where, Brady was sort of talking about like the whole ecosystem of social media and how attention like is the new sort of like is a new metric that everybody wants, and how it's affecting everybody's sort of like lives. And that conversation really rung true with me in terms of like how I consume media nowadays, how hard it is to stay focused because we're constantly asked to look at the latest thing and follow the latest feeds. But I just wanted to recommend them because they're just really smart and really sort of make you think of like the ecosystem we have to deal with, and and all that sort of stuff. They even mentioned in that episode, they talked a lot about like online creator burnout. Well, how is that happening, and all that sort of stuff. So
And how just keeping up even with consuming it is kind of like hurting us, which I think is an interesting topic for a future discussion.
Exactly. So thanks again for joining us this week. Hopefully you liked the episode. We'd love to hear from you, so please tweet at us at Truly Social on Twitter, and Miss Rogue for Tara, and for me, Carlos, it's at Carlos Pachet _CO. Alex, where's the best platform for you to connect with people?
Twitter, APGLSI.
It's not totally dead for him.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, if you like the show, please review us on iTunes. We really appreciate it.
Share.
Share. Obviously, with somebody that you think would really appreciate it. The designer in your life that you should share this episode with. We're always looking for ideas, guests for people to come to our show. So obviously, let us know if there's any subjects you guys
Anybody
want.
hook us up with BoJack?
Thank you very much. The TSI podcast is produced by Truly Social and edited by Joe Pacheco at Inner Light Music. Until next time,
We're truly social.
TTYS. All right. Thanks.